SUA, if you let them take him, you'll be arresting the wrong man. The words rang across the parking lot so clearly that even the hum of passing traffic seemed to hesitate. Outside Magnolia Diner on a warm Friday evening in Savannah, Georgia, flashing blue lights reflected across polished pickup trucks, rain-speckled windows, and the faded red letters of the old family restaurant. Dinner plates sat half-finished behind the glass as curious customers pressed closer to the windows, their conversations fading into uneasy silence. Some reached for their phones. Others simply watched, grateful that whatever trouble had arrived wasn't theirs. Near the entrance stood Naomi Brooks, a 25-year-old black waitress whose apron still carried the scent of fresh coffee and homemade peach pie. Her shift had already stretched past 10 exhausting hours. Her feet ached inside inexpensive black sneakers, and tomorrow's rent weighed heavily on her mind. None of that mattered the moment she noticed the confusion unfolding only a few feet away. Two police officers were speaking firmly with a tall man wearing a navy jacket, faded jeans, and a simple baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked nothing like the powerful executives who occasionally stopped by the diner for business lunches. If anything, he appeared tired, calm, and strangely resigned, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress strangers. Around him, assumptions multiplied faster than facts. Someone whispered that he must have stolen a luxury car. Another insisted he had tried to run from officers. Every new rumor traveled through the crowd before anyone bothered asking what had actually happened. Naomi had seen the entire incident from inside the diner. She had watched an impatient customer accuse the stranger of damaging an expensive vehicle after a shopping cart rolled loose during a sudden gust of wind. She had watched the man remain respectful while trying to explain. She had watched another witness quietly walk away instead of confirming the truth. Most importantly, she knew the officers had arrived after the loudest voices had already rewritten the story. Her manager grabbed her wrist gently. "Naomi," he whispered, "stay out of it. This isn't our business." She looked through the glass one more time. It became her business the second she realized the truth was standing alone. Taking a slow breath, she stepped outside, the evening air wrapping around her like a warning she chose to ignore. Every eye followed her as she walked toward the officers with steady steps, her heartbeat louder than the distant traffic crossing the bridge. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't trying to become a hero. She simply refused to let silence become another witness. "Officer," she said respectfully, keeping her voice calm despite the tension surrounding her, "I work here. I saw everything from the front window." One officer turned toward her with measured patience, while the other remained focused on the man. "Ma'am," he replied, "we're handling the situation." Most people would have nodded and walked away. Naomi didn't. "With respect," she answered, "you're missing part of what happened." For the first time, the stranger slowly lifted his eyes toward her. There was no panic in them. Only surprise. As if after years of navigating rooms filled with people who looked past one another, he never expected the one person willing to speak would be the waitress everyone else barely noticed. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Table. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. The officer glanced briefly toward the large front window of Magnolia Diner before returning his attention to Naomi. His expression remained professional, but uncertainty quietly settled across his face. Experience had taught him that the loudest witness was rarely the most reliable one, and the young waitress standing before him did not sound like someone chasing attention. She sounded like someone carrying responsibility. The small crowd surrounding the scene continued whispering among themselves, each conversation growing into another version of the story. Some insisted the stranger must have argued with the owner of the luxury sedan parked near the entrance. Others confidently claimed they had seen him trying to leave before the officers arrived, even though most of them had only walked outside after hearing raised voices. Assumptions traveled faster than truth. Naomi folded her trembling hands together to keep them steady. She was nervous, but fear had already surrendered to conviction. She pointed toward the diner window. "I was clearing table 6, she explained carefully. "I could see the parking lot the entire time. The shopping cart rolled because of the wind. He did not touch that car. He actually tried to stop the cart before it reached the vehicle. One officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner. The customer who had made the original complaint immediately interrupted. She works in a diner. Of course she is going to defend him. They probably know each other. Naomi turned toward the speaker without raising her voice. I have never seen him before tonight. Her answer came so naturally that several people in the crowd stopped whispering altogether. The stranger remained silent. His posture never changed. He neither encouraged Naomi nor attempted to defend himself. He simply watched as if measuring every word she spoke. It was an unusual calm, the kind carried by someone who understood that truth rarely needed to compete with panic. The evening breeze carried the scent of fried chicken, fresh biscuits, and approaching rain through the parking lot. Inside the diner, coffee continued pouring into waiting mugs while customers abandoned their meals to watch the scene unfold. Naomi's manager stood frozen by the entrance, silently hoping his employee was not about to create a problem that would bring unwanted headlines to the little restaurant. One of the officers finally nodded. Is there any way to verify what you saw? Naomi hesitated for only a second before her eyes drifted toward the corner of the building. Above the entrance, almost hidden beneath the old green awning, a small security camera pointed directly across the parking lot. She had walked beneath it every day for nearly 3 years without giving it much thought. Now it suddenly felt like the most important object on the property. The diner has security cameras, she said. If they are working, they should show everything. The customer who had filed the complaint immediately looked uncomfortable. Those cameras barely work, he muttered. They probably did not record anything. Naomi noticed the change in his confidence. Just moments earlier, he had spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. Now his voice had become noticeably quieter. The officers looked toward the manager. He swallowed hard before answering. They were upgraded last month. They record 24 hours a day. A silence settled over the parking lot unlike any before. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that arrives when facts quietly begin pushing rumors aside. The officer reached for his radio and requested access to the recording. Beside Naomi, the stranger finally spoke for the first time since she stepped outside. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Thank you, he said. Only 2 simple words. Yet something about the way he said them made Naomi realize he was not thanking her merely for speaking. He was thanking her for doing what almost everyone else had chosen not to do. Standing for the truth when remaining silent would have been much easier. The manager hurried inside without another word, disappearing behind the front counter where the security monitor was kept in a cramped office that smelled of old filing cabinets, printer paper, and fresh coffee. Every second suddenly felt heavier than the last. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody laughed. Even the customer who had confidently blamed the stranger folded his arms and stared toward the diner entrance instead of meeting anyone's eyes. Naomi remained where she stood, her heart refusing to slow down. She wondered if she had remembered everything correctly. Memory could be fragile under pressure. She replayed the scene in her mind again and again, watching the runaway shopping cart roll across the parking lot, seeing the stranger step forward, reaching for the handle just before the wind carried it into the side of the expensive sedan. She remembered the metallic sound that followed, not because he caused it, but because he had almost prevented it. The details were still vivid. The sky had darkened. The breeze had become stronger. Everything had happened in less than 10 seconds. A few moments later, the manager returned carrying a small tablet connected to the security system. One of the officers accepted it and carefully scrolled backward through the recording. The crowd instinctively leaned closer, united by curiosity more than compassion. Faces that had been so eager to judge now searched silently for certainty. The video began playing, grainy but clear enough. There was the shopping cart. There was the sudden gust of wind. There was the stranger stepping toward it instead of away from it. The footage showed him stretching out his arm in an attempt to stop the cart before it clipped the parked vehicle. It also showed something almost nobody outside had noticed. The customer who had filed the complaint had been standing only a few feet away. He watched the cart begin rolling and simply stepped aside without making any effort to stop it himself. Nobody spoke while the recording continued. The silence grew almost uncomfortable because the truth required no explanation. It simply existed. The officer paused the video and watched it again from another angle. Then once more. His expression softened. He turned toward the stranger first. "Sir, it appears there has been a misunderstanding. Thank you for your patience." The words carried genuine professionalism rather than embarrassment. The second officer faced the complaining customer with measured calm and asked several quiet questions that the surrounding crowd could no longer hear. The confident accusations disappeared almost instantly. People slowly lowered their phones. Some quietly returned to their tables. Others shook their heads, realizing how quickly they had accepted a story that happened to sound believable. Naomi released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. Relief washed over her, but it was not the relief of winning an argument. It was the quiet comfort of knowing that honesty had been given a chance before it was too late. The stranger adjusted the sleeve of his navy jacket and offered the officers a respectful nod before turning toward Naomi once again. Up close, she noticed details she had missed earlier. His clothes were simple, but perfectly tailored. His shoes carried road dust, yet they were made from fine leather. His wristwatch looked understated, though unmistakably expensive to anyone who recognized craftsmanship instead of flashy logos. Still, nothing about him suggested arrogance. If anything, he looked like a man accustomed to listening far more than speaking. "Most people would have stayed inside," he said with a faint smile that barely reached his eyes. Naomi shrugged gently. "Most people probably thought someone else would say something." He studied her answer for a long second, almost as though committing it to memory. Then he nodded once. "Perhaps that is exactly why the truth needs people like you." Before Naomi could respond, a sleek black sedan quietly pulled into the parking lot. The driver stepped out wearing a charcoal suit, opened the rear passenger door without saying a word, and waited patiently. Naomi blinked in surprise, sensing for the first time that the quiet stranger she had defended might not be an ordinary customer after all. Naomi watched the black sedan in quiet confusion as the driver held the rear door open with practiced precision. There were no company logos, no flashing lights, no unnecessary display of importance. Everything about the vehicle whispered discipline instead of wealth. The stranger offered Naomi one final nod, the kind exchange between two people who understood that gratitude did not always require a speech. Then he stepped inside, and within seconds the sedan disappeared into the evening traffic, leaving behind nothing but fading taillights and a parking lot filled with unanswered questions. The customers slowly drifted back toward their dinners, their conversations no longer centered on accusations, but on curiosity. Some wondered who the man had been. Others admitted they had judged too quickly. Naomi remained standing near the entrance until her manager gently called her back inside. "You all right?" he asked while straightening a stack of menus that did not actually need straightening. She smiled faintly. "I think so." He studied her for a moment before shaking his head with a quiet laugh. "You have a habit of making ordinary nights unforgettable." Naomi returned to her section, refilling coffee cups and delivering slices of pecan pie as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the rhythm of the diner felt different now. The old jukebox still played classic country songs. The ceiling fan still turned lazily beneath the worn wooden beams. Families still laughed over burgers and milkshakes. But every so often someone glanced toward Naomi with new respect, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had chosen honesty when silence would have been easier. By closing time, the parking lot had emptied beneath a sky filled with scattered stars. Naomi folded her apron carefully, wiped down the last booth, and counted her tips. It was enough to cover groceries, but not enough to stop worrying about next month's bills. Reality had a way of returning quickly. She locked the diner with her manager, climbed into her aging sedan, and drove across Savannah's quiet streets toward the small apartment she shared with her younger cousin, Jasmine, a nursing student balancing classes with part-time work. Their home was modest but warm, decorated with second-hand furniture, family photographs, and a small bookshelf filled with novels borrowed from the public library. Jasmine looked up from her textbooks as Naomi walked through the door. "Long night?" she asked. Naomi nodded before pouring herself a glass of water. "Longer than usual." She shared the story, leaving out nothing except one detail. She never mentioned the expensive watch, the tailored jacket, or the waiting chauffeur. Somehow those things felt less important than the choice she had made. Jasmine listened quietly before smiling. "Granddad used to say character is what you do before anyone knows your name." Naomi smiled back. Their grandfather had repeated that sentence so often it had become part of the family itself. The next morning, nearly 50 miles away in downtown Savannah, the same quiet stranger entered the top floor of a glass office tower overlooking the river. Employees who had been chatting moments earlier immediately stood as he walked through the executive hallway. Board members closed their conversations. Assistants straightened their posture. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," voices echoed one after another. Ethan Caldwell acknowledged each greeting with calm professionalism before stepping into a conference room where financial reports, architectural models, and redevelopment maps covered a polished walnut table. As founder and chief executive officer of Caldwell Dynamics, he was preparing to approve one of the largest neighborhood revitalization projects in Georgia, a project that quietly included a familiar block where a small family diner had stood for more than 40 years. Yet before discussing a single contract, Ethan looked toward his chief of staff and asked one unexpected question. "Can you find out everything there is to know about Magnolia Diner?" The room fell silent. Nobody understood why that humble restaurant had suddenly become more important than a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan simply remembered the young waitress who had chosen truth over comfort, and for the first time in many years, a business decision had become deeply personal. The executive conference room overlooked the Savannah River, where cargo ships drifted silently beneath the morning sun, but Ethan Caldwell barely noticed the view. His attention rested on a single photograph that his chief of staff had quietly placed beside the redevelopment proposal. It was not a corporate profile or a financial report. It was a simple image of Magnolia Diner taken from the county tax records. The faded sign, the cracked parking lot, the flower boxes beneath the windows, and the old brick walls looked exactly as they had the night before. Ethan studied the picture longer than anyone in the room expected. Around the polished table sat architects, attorneys, financial analysts, and project directors waiting to discuss a redevelopment plan valued at nearly $400 million. Entire neighborhoods were about to change. New apartments, retail spaces, offices, parks, and restaurants filled the presentation boards surrounding them. Yet Ethan's first question had nothing to do with profit projections. Who owns Magnolia Diner? The chief of staff opened a folder. Margaret Ellis. She inherited it from her parents almost 20 years ago. Business has slowed over the last 5 years. Property taxes have increased, maintenance costs continue rising, and several developers have already approached her with purchase offers. Ethan remained silent. Another executive added, "Under the current proposal, that corner will eventually be cleared for mixed-use development." Nobody noticed Ethan's expression change except his longtime legal advisor, who had worked beside him for nearly 15 years. He recognized that look. It appeared whenever Ethan believed numbers alone were missing the human story. "Has anyone actually spoken with the owner?" Ethan asked. The room exchanged uncertain glances. They had reviewed surveys, zoning reports, engineering studies, and economic forecasts. Nobody had visited the diner. Nobody had asked what the restaurant meant to the people who walked through its doors every morning. Ethan closed the folder gently instead of approving the next agenda item. "Schedule a community review before we make any final decisions." Several executives looked surprised. Delaying a project of that size was unusual, but nobody questioned the instruction. Meanwhile, across town, Magnolia Diner welcomed another busy breakfast rush. The smell of fresh biscuits, sizzling bacon, and cinnamon pancakes floated through the dining room as sunlight spilled across checkered tile floors polished by decades of hard-working employees. Naomi tied her apron and greeted regular customers by name. Mr. Henderson ordered the same scrambled eggs he had eaten every Tuesday for 11 years. Mrs. Alvarez asked for extra strawberry jam with her toast. Truck drivers laughed over steaming mugs of coffee before heading back onto Interstate 95. To Naomi, life had returned to normal. She had no idea that somewhere across the city an entire boardroom had just paused because of one decision she made the night before. During a brief break, her manager, Carl Benson, approached carrying the monthly maintenance invoices. His cheerful smile had disappeared. "The freezer needs another repair," he sighed. "The roof still leaks near the storage room, and insurance premiums are going up again." Naomi listened quietly. She knew the diner survived one careful month at a time. Every broken appliance, every unexpected expense, every slow week mattered. Carl forced a smile before returning the paperwork to his office. "We will figure it out like we always do." Naomi believed him because she wanted to believe him. Outside, an elderly customer paused before leaving and admired the old building one more time. "Places like this are disappearing," he said softly. "Feels like every neighborhood loses its heart eventually." Naomi watched him drive away without realizing how close those words were to becoming reality. Across Savannah, Ethan Caldwell stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking toward the same part of the city where Magnolia Diner had welcomed generations of families. Quietly, almost to himself, he made a decision that would soon change far more than a single business contract. By late afternoon, the conference room had transformed into something far different from an ordinary planning session. The glossy renderings of luxury apartments and office towers had been pushed aside, while photographs of neighborhood businesses filled the main screen. Ethan Caldwell stood with one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair as his development team presented a detailed report on every family-owned business located within the redevelopment district. Bakery, barbershop, pharmacy, hardware store. Then Magnolia Diner appeared once again. "Annual revenue has declined for 4 consecutive years," the analyst explained. "The building requires structural repairs, the kitchen equipment is aging, and property taxes are projected to increase another 11% next year. From a financial perspective, purchasing the property would be significantly more efficient than preserving it." Ethan remained quiet long enough for the room to wonder if he agreed. Finally, he asked a simple question. "How many employees depend on that diner?" The analyst glanced back at the report. 12 full-time positions and 6 part-time employees. Ethan nodded. "And how many regular customers?" The room fell silent. Nobody had calculated that figure because loyalty could not be measured on a spreadsheet. An elderly attorney who had advised Ethan since the earliest days of Caldwell Dynamics leaned forward. "Sometimes the strongest investment is not the cheapest one," he said softly. Ethan offered the faintest smile. Exactly. Across town, Magnolia Diner carried on with another ordinary afternoon that felt anything but ordinary to Naomi. She noticed Carl studying invoices more often than customers. Every time the front door opened, he looked up with hopeful eyes, only to return quietly to the stack of bills waiting beside the cash register. Naomi refilled coffee for a retired schoolteacher who had eaten lunch there every Wednesday for nearly 15 years. "You know," the woman said while stirring cream into her coffee, "my husband proposed to me in booth number 4. We have celebrated every anniversary here since 1989. Naomi smiled warmly. "Then this place has been part of your family for a long time." "It has," the woman replied. "Places like this remember people." Those words lingered in Naomi's mind long after the customer left. She looked around the dining room differently. The worn wooden booths were scratched with decades of quiet history. The faded photographs hanging along the walls showed little league teams, church fundraisers, military homecomings, and holiday dinners shared by neighbors who had grown older together beneath the same ceiling fans. Magnolia Diner was more than a restaurant. It was a collection of memories that happened to serve breakfast. As evening approached, Carl gathered the staff for a brief meeting before dinner service. His voice remained optimistic, but the concern behind it was impossible to miss. "I just want everyone to know that we may have a few difficult months ahead," he admitted. "Business has been unpredictable, and repairs keep adding up. We are going to keep fighting because that is what this place has always done." Nobody complained. Nobody asked whether their jobs were safe. Instead, each employee quietly returned to work with renewed determination. Naomi adjusted the flowers on every table before greeting the first dinner guests with the same genuine smile she offered every customer, believing kindness should never depend on circumstances. At nearly the same moment, Ethan signed a single document authorizing a complete community impact review before any redevelopment decision could move forward. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Delaying the project would cost both time and money. Ethan accepted that without hesitation. As he placed his pen on the polished walnut table, he looked toward the city skyline beyond his office window and spoke with calm certainty. "Before we change a neighborhood," he said, "we owe it the respect of understanding what we are about to change." The following morning arrived with the quiet confidence of an ordinary weekday. Yet something invisible had already begun shifting beneath the familiar streets of Savannah. Magnolia Diner opened at 6 o'clock sharp as it always had. The coffee brewed before sunrise. The grill warmed slowly. The front door chimed every few minutes as regular customers greeted one another by first name. Naomi Brooks slipped effortlessly into her routine, balancing heavy breakfast trays with practiced grace while smiling at every guest who walked through the door. She never mentioned what had happened the evening before. To her, telling the truth had never been extraordinary. It had simply been the right thing to do. Around 8:30, Carl Benson stepped outside carrying a clipboard, checking a delivery that was running late. His attention drifted across the street where several unfamiliar people stood taking photographs of nearby buildings. One measured sidewalks. Another examined utility poles. A third studied maps spread across the hood of a white SUV. Carl frowned. Construction crews occasionally surveyed the neighborhood, but something about this group felt different. They looked organized, intentional. When he returned inside, he quietly mentioned it to Naomi. Probably another inspection, she replied while pouring fresh coffee for an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. Maybe, Carl answered, though his voice carried little confidence. Across downtown, Ethan Caldwell sat alone in his office reviewing the completed community impact report that had arrived earlier than expected. Unlike the financial summaries stacked beside it, this report contained handwritten interviews, family histories, and photographs collected over decades. One page described Magnolia Diner as the unofficial gathering place after local high school football games. Another explained that volunteers organized holiday meal drives from its parking lot every Thanksgiving. A retired firefighter described it as the first place he visited after leaving the hospital following heart surgery because the staff already knew exactly how he liked his coffee. Ethan slowly closed the report. The numbers mattered. They always had. But stories explained what numbers never could. He pressed the intercom. "Have my car ready in 30 minutes. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," his assistant replied. "Would you like security to accompany you?" Ethan paused briefly before answering. "No. Today I would rather arrive as a guest than an executive." Back at Magnolia Diner, lunch preparations were already underway when Naomi noticed the elderly woman from the previous afternoon entering with a small bouquet of fresh daisies. "These belong by the front window," she smiled. "My husband always said flowers make strangers feel welcome." Naomi carefully placed the bouquet beside the register, watching sunlight illuminate the bright white petals. The simple gesture warmed the entire room. Sometimes kindness arrived quietly, asking for nothing in return. Outside, traffic continued flowing past the old diner while the survey team packed their equipment into waiting vehicles. None of the employees realized that every photograph, every measurement, and every handwritten note would soon become part of a decision capable of changing the future of the entire neighborhood. Carl glanced once more through the front window before returning to the kitchen. "Whatever is happening," he muttered softly, "I hope this old place survives it." Naomi looked around the dining room filled with familiar faces, steaming coffee mugs, laughter, and conversations that had echoed inside those walls for generations. She believed places built on genuine care somehow found a way to endure. Yet beyond the glass, a sleek black sedan quietly turned onto the street, slowing as it approached Magnolia Diner. No sirens, no flashing lights, no grand announcement. Only a single visitor returning for a reason nobody inside could possibly imagine. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Table. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. The black sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the faded Magnolia Diner sign, its polished finish reflecting the morning sunlight across the weathered brick walls. For a brief moment, nobody inside paid much attention. Expensive cars occasionally passed through Savannah on their way to somewhere else. They rarely stopped at places like Magnolia Diner. Naomi carried 2 plates of pancakes toward booth number 3 when she noticed Carl staring through the front window again. "Do you know them?" she asked. Carl slowly shook his head. "No, but they definitely are not here for the coffee." The front door opened with its familiar chime. A man in a charcoal suit stepped inside first, quietly scanning the dining room before respectfully moving aside. Then Ethan Caldwell entered wearing another simple navy jacket. No tie, no public display of wealth, looking almost identical to the man Naomi had defended the previous evening. The only difference was the confidence surrounding him now. It was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations gradually faded as several customers recognized the expensive sedan parked outside. Naomi blinked in surprise before walking toward him with the same warm smile she offered every guest. "Good morning," she said naturally. "Table for one." Ethan smiled. "If you have one available. Booth 6 is open." "Perfect." She led him across the dining room without realizing nearly every pair of eyes had begun following them. Ethan thanked her, accepted a menu, and quietly ordered black coffee with the breakfast special. There was no mention of the previous night. No dramatic speech. No grand entrance. He simply behaved like another customer. While Naomi poured fresh coffee, Carl approached carefully. "Sir," he said politely, "I remember you from yesterday." Ethan nodded. "Then allow me to thank both of you once again." Carl smiled awkwardly. "We are just glad everything worked out." Ethan looked around the diner before answering. Sometimes the people who help the most never realize the difference they make. Before Carl could respond, another vehicle stopped outside. Then another. Within less than 2 minutes, 4 additional black SUVs quietly lined the curb. Several men and women dressed in business attire stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying leather portfolios and tablet computers. Customers turned toward the windows almost in unison. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Coffee cups remained suspended above saucers. Someone whispered, "Who in the world is that?" Carl stepped outside just as one of the visitors greeted him with a professional smile. "Good morning. We are looking for Mr. Ethan Caldwell." Carl pointed toward booth 6 with visible confusion. The group entered together, stopping respectfully beside Ethan's table. Without hesitation, every one of them addressed him the same way. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." The dining room fell completely silent. One woman placed a thick folder on the table. "The community redevelopment documents are ready for your review, sir. The mayor's office confirmed this afternoon's meeting, and the board is waiting for your final recommendation." Naomi stood frozen beside the coffee station, the glass pitcher still warm in her hands. She looked from Ethan to the executives, then back toward the line of luxury vehicles outside. Her mind replayed the previous evening in an instant. The calm stranger, the security footage, the chauffeur, the quiet gratitude. Suddenly, every unexplained detail fit together. Carl's face turned pale as recognition finally reached him. He had seen Ethan Caldwell's photograph before, not in gossip magazines, but in local business journals covering billion-dollar investments across Georgia. The realization spread through the diner almost like sunrise. This was not merely an important businessman. This was the founder of Caldwell Dynamics, the very company rumored to be reshaping entire neighborhoods across Savannah. Yet Ethan remained seated in the same booth, holding the same white ceramic coffee mug Naomi had just refilled, as though titles and headlines mattered far less than the simple kindness that had brought him back to Magnolia Diner in the first place. No one inside Magnolia Diner seemed to remember breathing. The quiet that settled across the dining room felt almost sacred, broken only by the soft hiss of bacon on the grill and the distant clink of silverware from the kitchen. Naomi stood motionless beside the coffee station, trying to reconcile the calm customer she had served only moments earlier with the man every executive in tailored suits addressed with unmistakable respect. Ethan Caldwell noticed the stunned expressions surrounding him, yet nothing about his posture changed. He did not stand to command attention. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he looked toward the group waiting beside his booth and said gently, "Please give me another few minutes." Every executive immediately nodded. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell." They stepped back without hesitation, allowing him to finish the simple breakfast that had grown cold while the room tried to understand who he truly was. Carl slowly approached the booth, still struggling to process everything he had just witnessed. "Sir," he said carefully, "if I had known." Ethan looked up with a warm smile and quietly interrupted him. "That is exactly why I did not tell anyone." Carl hesitated. "You wanted to be treated like everyone else." "I wanted to see a place where people still treated everyone with respect before knowing their title." His answer settled over the room with more weight than any business presentation could have carried. Naomi finally gathered enough composure to refill his coffee. Her hands remained steady, but her thoughts raced. "I owe you an apology," she admitted softly. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" "I had no idea who you were." A faint smile crossed his face. "Naomi, yesterday you defended someone you believed was an ordinary stranger. If you had known I was a billionaire, your decision would have meant less, not more." She lowered her eyes for a brief moment, humbled by the truth in his words. Ethan continued, "Character is revealed when there is nothing to gain." The elderly couple seated near the window exchanged quiet smiles. They had watched the entire exchange without saying a word, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more valuable than wealth. One of Ethan's senior advisors stepped forward holding the redevelopment folder. "Sir, the mayor's office has asked whether the Magnolia property will remain part of today's discussion." Ethan accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked around the diner once more. A young father helped his daughter color on a children's menu. Two retired veterans laughed over coffee in the corner booth. A nurse wearing hospital scrubs grabbed a quick breakfast before another long shift. Every table carried its own story, and together those stories created something no blueprint could replace. Ethan finally opened the folder, studying the architectural rendering for only a few seconds before quietly closing it again. "Revise the proposal," he instructed. His advisor blinked. "Sir, remove Magnolia Diner from the demolition plan." The words landed like a sudden change in the weather. Several executives exchanged surprised glances, but none questioned the order. Ethan continued calmly. "I asked for a community review because places like this cannot be measured only by square footage or market value. They hold memories, relationships, and trust. If we erase those, we are not improving a neighborhood. We are simply replacing it." Naomi looked toward Carl, whose eyes had begun to glisten with cautious hope. He had spent months worrying about bills, repairs, and rumors of redevelopment. Now, for the first time, it seemed possible that the future might not be decided by numbers alone. Ethan stood, placed enough cash on the table to cover breakfast and a generous tip, then picked up the folder under his arm. Before walking toward the door, he turned back to Naomi. "Yesterday you reminded me that truth deserves someone willing to stand beside it. Today I intend to return that favor." The moment Ethan Caldwell stepped outside, the line of black vehicles pulled away with quiet precision, leaving Magnolia Diner standing exactly where it had always been, yet somehow feeling entirely different. Customers slowly returned to their meals, but conversations no longer revolved around pancakes or weather forecasts. Every table buzzed with the same question. Why would one of the most influential business leaders in Georgia spend his morning inside a small neighborhood diner? Carl stood behind the register holding the redevelopment folder Ethan had briefly left for his assistant to collect later. He stared at the elegant company logo embossed across the cover before carefully placing it on a shelf as though it belonged in a museum rather than beside the cash register. Naomi resumed serving coffee, determined not to let the morning distract her from the people who had trusted her with their breakfast. Yet every few minutes another customer stopped her with a smile or a quiet word of appreciation. "You did the right thing yesterday," one retired teacher told her while leaving a generous tip. "The world needs more people who speak before it is convenient." Naomi thanked her politely, still struggling to understand how one simple decision had grown into something much larger than herself. Around noon, Carl received an unexpected phone call. He answered with his usual cheerful greeting, but his expression changed almost immediately. "Yes, this is Carl Benson. Yes, she works here. Of course. We would be honored." He slowly hung up and looked toward Naomi with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. That was Caldwell Dynamics. The entire kitchen seemed to pause. Even the cook looked up from the grill. Carl continued carefully, almost afraid the words might disappear if he spoke too quickly. "Their community outreach office wants to meet with us tomorrow morning. They said Mr. Caldwell requested a full review of everything this diner needs before any redevelopment decisions are finalized." Naomi blinked. "Everything, everything," Carl repeated. "The roof, the kitchen equipment, accessibility improvements, parking lot repairs." They asked for a complete list. The employees exchanged uncertain glances. Hope could be dangerous when life had taught them disappointment, yet none of them could ignore what they had just heard. That afternoon, while Magnolia Diner remained busy with lunch customers, Ethan sat inside City Hall across from the mayor, city planners, and members of the redevelopment committee. Architectural drawings covered the conference table once again. One official pointed toward the section containing Magnolia Diner. "Removing this parcel complicates the layout," he explained. "It is the most efficient location for the planned commercial entrance." Ethan studied the map before answering calmly. "Efficient for traffic, perhaps. Not necessarily for people." Another committee member leaned forward. "You are willing to redesign an entire section because of one small restaurant." Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "Not because of a restaurant. Because of what it represents." The room became quiet. Ethan continued without raising his voice. "Communities are not built by concrete alone. They are built by trust. Yesterday, I met someone who defended a complete stranger because she believed truth mattered more than convenience. If a neighborhood still produces people like that, then preserving places that help shape them is not sentiment. It is smart investment." No one interrupted him. The discussion that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, but the direction of the project had already begun to change. As the afternoon sun settled across Savannah, Magnolia Diner carried on exactly as it always had, serving families, travelers, nurses, teachers, mechanics, and retirees. Naomi moved quietly from table to table, unaware that inside boardrooms and government offices, decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were slowly being rewritten because one waitress had chosen honesty when nobody expected anyone to speak. The next morning, Magnolia Diner opened with the same familiar rhythm that had carried it through 4 decades of changing seasons. The coffee brewed before sunrise. Fresh biscuits came out of the oven. The front door chimed as regular customers wandered in, greeting one another like neighbors instead of strangers. Yet beneath the comforting routine, anticipation quietly filled the air. Every employee knew representatives from Caldwell Dynamics were scheduled to arrive before lunch. Nobody knew exactly what that meeting would bring. Carl Benson gathered invoices, repair estimates, inspection reports, and handwritten notes describing every challenge the diner had faced during the past several years. The leaking roof, the aging refrigeration system, the cracked parking lot, the outdated electrical wiring. None of it was hidden. Carl believed honesty had kept the diner alive this long, and honesty would guide whatever happened next. At precisely 10 o'clock, 3 vehicles pulled into the parking lot. This time there were no long lines of luxury sport utility vehicles or dramatic entrances. Instead, a small team of architects, engineers, financial specialists, and community planners walked through the front door, carrying measuring equipment, clipboards, and rolled construction drawings. Ethan Caldwell arrived with them, dressed as simply as before. Naomi welcomed every visitor with the same smile she offered every customer. She did not treat Ethan differently because she now knew his title. Ethan noticed that immediately, and it quietly confirmed everything he had believed about her character. One engineer carefully examined the kitchen while another inspected the roof. An accessibility consultant measured doorways and restroom entrances. A financial advisor reviewed operating expenses with Carl. Every question focused on one goal: not how to replace Magnolia Diner, but how to help it continue serving the neighborhood for decades to come. Carl finally asked the question everyone had been quietly wondering. "Mr. Caldwell, why are you doing all of this?" Ethan looked around the dining room before answering. "Because communities deserve more than beautiful buildings. They deserve places where people still know one another's names." He paused briefly before continuing. "Yesterday, I realized this diner creates something my company cannot manufacture. Trust. That is worth protecting." The room grew quiet. Even the construction consultants stopped writing for a moment. Ethan unfolded a revised redevelopment drawing across one of the empty booths. The new design looked remarkably different from the original proposal. Magnolia Diner remained exactly where it had always stood. Around it stretched landscaped walkways, new parking spaces, improved sidewalks, public gathering areas, and several small storefronts designed to support other local businesses instead of replacing them. Carl stared at the drawing in disbelief. "You changed the entire entrance to the project." Ethan nodded. "We redesigned nearly 12 acres. One architect smiled. It took our team all night." Naomi looked from the drawing to Ethan, still struggling to understand how one evening outside the diner had led to such an enormous decision. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. "Businesses succeed because of strategies," he said quietly. "Communities survive because of people. Yesterday, you reminded me not to confuse the two." Before leaving, Ethan handed Carl a formal letter bearing the Caldwell Dynamics seal. Inside was a commitment to fund structural repairs, modernize the kitchen, improve accessibility, restore the exterior, and establish a neighborhood preservation partnership that would allow Magnolia Diner to remain independently owned while benefiting from the larger redevelopment project. Carl lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak for several long seconds. Naomi glanced around the familiar dining room, imagining repaired ceilings, brighter windows, safer equipment, and the same laughter continuing for generations yet to come. What had begun as one person's quiet decision to defend the truth had now become something far greater. It had transformed a project measured in dollars into one measured by the lives it would protect. Work on Magnolia Diner began only 2 weeks later, but the transformation reached far beyond new walls and fresh paint. Construction crews repaired the roof without forcing the restaurant to close. Electricians replaced aging wiring after business hours so breakfast could still be served at sunrise. Local craftsmen restored the original brick exterior instead of covering it, preserving the character generations of families recognized the moment they turned onto the street. New wheelchair-accessible entrances welcomed every guest with dignity. The old parking lot was repaved, flower beds were planted beneath the front windows, and the familiar Magnolia Diner sign was carefully restored rather than replaced. Ethan Caldwell visited several times during the renovation, always without fanfare. He greeted cooks, dishwashers, delivery drivers, and customers with the same quiet respect he had shown on his very first visit. One afternoon, he found Naomi arranging fresh flowers near the front counter before the lunch rush. "It already feels different," she said while stepping back to admire the brighter dining room. Ethan smiled gently. "The building looks different." The heart stayed exactly the same. Naomi laughed softly. "That was the important part." Ethan nodded. "Exactly." As the final inspections approached, Caldwell Dynamics organized a small community gathering inside the newly restored diner. There were no velvet ropes, no private guest list, and no expensive decorations. Teachers sat beside mechanics. Nurses shared tables with business owners. Families who had celebrated birthdays inside Magnolia Diner for decades returned once again. Carl Benson looked around the crowded dining room with grateful disbelief. "I have dreamed about seeing this place full again," he admitted. Ethan stepped forward carrying a simple envelope instead of an oversized ceremonial check. "Carl," he said, "this belongs to you first." Carl opened it carefully. Inside was a signed agreement confirming that Magnolia Diner would remain independently owned, protected through a long-term neighborhood preservation partnership funded by Caldwell Dynamics. There was another page as well. A grant establishing a hospitality training program that would create paid internships for local high school and community college students who wanted to build careers in restaurants, customer service, or business management. Carl looked up with moist eyes. "This helps far more than us." "That is the idea," Ethan answered. He then turned toward Naomi. Every conversation in the room gradually faded. Ethan handed her a small navy folder. "I have one more request." Naomi accepted it carefully, unsure what she would find inside. The first page contained an official offer from Caldwell Dynamics. Not for a corporate office. Not for a management position hundreds of miles away. Instead, it created an entirely new role. Community Partnership Coordinator for the Magnolia District Revitalization Project. Her responsibility would be to represent neighborhood businesses, local families, nonprofit organizations, and residents during every future stage of redevelopment, so that no important decision would ever again be made without listening to the people who actually live there. Naomi looked at the offer, then back at Ethan. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because you prove that you protect people before you know who they are. That is exactly the kind of judgment communities need." Naomi remained silent for several long seconds. She remembered standing outside the diner, believing she might simply be correcting a misunderstanding. She had never imagined that one honest decision would lead to an opportunity to protect an entire neighborhood. Finally, she smiled. "I will accept," she said. The room erupted into warm applause, not because someone had become important, but because someone who had always been important was finally being seen for exactly who she had been all along. 6 months later, the morning sun rose over Magnolia Diner, just as it always had, but the neighborhood surrounding it carried a new sense of life. Fresh trees lined the sidewalks. Families gathered in the small public plaza across the street. Local shops that once feared closing their doors now welcomed steady streams of customers. Children rode bicycles along safer walkways while neighbors lingered on newly installed benches, talking as though time itself had slowed down long enough to let community matter again. Yet inside Magnolia Diner, some things had never changed. The aroma of fresh coffee still greeted every guest before sunrise. The familiar sound of sizzling bacon drifted from the kitchen. The old jukebox still played classic country songs, and regular customers still argued playfully over who made the best peach pie in Savannah. Carl Benson continued greeting everyone by name. Margaret Ellis still smiled each time she unlocked the front door. And Naomi Brooks still wore an apron several mornings each week, even though her responsibilities now stretched far beyond serving breakfast. As community partnership coordinator, she spent afternoons meeting with neighborhood organizations, listening to small business owners, helping local families navigate new opportunities, and making certain every future project respected the people who called the Magnolia District home. Yet whenever the diner became busy, she quietly returned behind the coffee counter without hesitation. More than once, visitors asked why someone with an executive title still served coffee. Naomi always answered with the same gentle smile. Because this is where I learned who I wanted to be. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan Caldwell returned once again without an announcement. There were no television cameras waiting outside. No reporters. No speeches. He simply walked through the front door, took his usual seat in booth 6, and ordered black coffee with the breakfast special, even though it was well past lunchtime. Naomi laughed as she placed the mug in front of him. Some habits never change. Ethan smiled. Neither should the good ones. They looked around the dining room together. Every table was filled. Students worked on homework beside retirees reading newspapers. Construction workers shared lunch with architects helping design the next phase of the neighborhood. Families celebrated birthdays beneath restored wooden beams that now looked stronger than ever. Ethan quietly observed the room before speaking. Do you remember what happened the first time we met? Naomi nodded. I remember thinking someone needed to tell the truth. Ethan looked toward the front window where sunlight reflected across the same parking lot where everything had begun. Most people believe communities are changed by billion-dollar decisions, he said softly. I think they are changed by moments. One honest moment. One courageous decision. One person choosing not to look away. Naomi smiled thoughtfully. I almost stayed inside that night. Ethan looked at her with quiet sincerity. And I almost lost faith that success could still recognize character. Silence settled comfortably between them, not awkward, but grateful. Outside, another customer held the door open for an elderly couple. Inside, a young waitress welcomed them with the same kindness Naomi had once shown a stranger she believed needed someone willing to stand beside the truth. Nothing about that moment seemed extraordinary. Yet perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Real courage rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, wearing an apron instead of a title, speaking with kindness instead of pride, and changing lives without expecting anything in return. Wealth had preserved a building, but character had preserved its purpose. Long after business reports were forgotten and construction projects were completed, the story people continued telling throughout Savannah was never about the billionaire who changed a neighborhood. It was about the young black waitress who reminded one powerful man that the greatest investment anyone can make will always be in people. And in the end, that simple act of courage became the foundation upon which an entire community found hope once again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, we'll save you a seat at the Hidden Table.